Welcome, everyone. I'm Sunil Beda. I'm the Chief Technology Officer for ComplySci. And just as a quick bio around myself, I've been at ComplySci for about 2 years. I've been in the compliance space for about 7. So prior to my time here at ComplySci, I was working at another compliance firm, mainly dealing with training for Fortune 500 companies. But I've learned a lot both from previous jobs and from here as well in terms of the compliance space in general. Also joining me today is Benjamin Danso. He's the Associate Director for Optima Partners Compliance Advisory. And before we get started, Ben, do you want to give a little bit of a bio about yourself?
Sure, thanks, Neil. So I work with Optima Consulting Partners. We provide compliance and reg support for wholesale firms in the UK, US, and across Asia. Although a young company, it's less than 8 years old, we have 6 offices and over 1,200 clients in the aforementioned jurisdictions. I'm one of the directors at Optima Consulting Partners and have been here for over 6 years now, quite a while. I support a multitude of asset managers in the UK, mainly dual regulated ones, FCA and SEC/NFA. And prior to this, I was at the FCA after stints at the Royal Bank of Scotland and Deloitte as well.
Great. So, with this, we're going to go ahead and start to talk about the agenda and talk about some of the trends that are happening in the compliance space, specifically like shifting work environments, cryptocurrency, tracking MNPI, data management, and future regulatory items that are popping up. And so, with that, why don't we just jump into the topic areas, because I know everyone's eager to hear more about some of the trends that we're speaking about in general. As all of you know, and I'm sure everyone has experienced this already, there's a shifting workplace environment, right? With the pandemic and with all the regulations and things that have gone out there, the work from home space has really shifted the work environment completely. And as we start to think about that shift in work environment, we're really thinking about the trends that it takes on, meaning that are those things going to continue to stay, or is an office work environment going to come back? And what we're starting to see is sort of a hybrid approach around all of this sort of stuff. So as we start to think about the shift in workplace, we also think about it from a compliance perspective as well, right? It's because as employees, working in a work environment, they're working with colleagues, they're working with others around the clock. But working from a home environment, you're really by yourself. There's lots of other distractions that can occur. And so when we start to think about that, we're really thinking about, from a compliance standpoint, the employee monitoring. How do we do employee monitoring? How do we think about that from that perspective? And so as we start to push forward in terms of compliance, we think technology is a big play. And obviously, me being a chief technology officer, I'm always thinking about, from a technology perspective, like how do we increase efficiencies, but also provide compliance in the ways that regulatory environments need to occur. But beyond that too, we start to look at what is the difference between the workplace and the home environment, and what kinds of monitoring that can occur from that perspective. And so we start to think more and more about how these two worlds are starting to collide, and how do we ensure compliance can do what they need to do. Ben, I'm going to ask you, from your experience, as you start to work with clients too, how has the shift in the workplace affected the way you approach it as well?
Okay, so no, I think the first thing for most firms to understand and to get comfortable with is that the regulator is okay and has adjusted to this work environment so far, remote working environment so far. So if I sort of take it back to the COVID, height of COVID, remote working situation last year, where you had the FCA, for example, sending out numerous questionnaires and surveys to firms to find out how they were doing and how they were coping operationally, how they're monitoring oversight. And overwhelmingly, the response from the FCA was quite positive, and it was quite a good sort of green tick for the industry as a whole, that actually we managed to continue BAU. The clients still no sort of disruption to business processes, no massive cases of insider trading or market abuse had occurred in that space that we know of yet. And this was a massive sort of green light for the regulator. Swinging back to this summer, where in the UK you've had the lessening of government requirements, where the government has allowed people to return back to work, and the FCA adjusted to that as well. So we've had now they're asking for firms to rationale as to why, if firms are going to take on the hybrid working environment, why is that okay, and are they okay to maintain this for the immediate and long-term sort of future going forward? And then, of course, last week you've had the latest news from the government guidance asking us in the UK to go back to work remotely if possible. And I suggest that yes, they would be okay with that as well. So we do have a dynamic regulator who understands the to and fro and the changing environments and requirements to work from home. I think the biggest or the most frequent questions we've had has been down to oversight and governance and oversight. And this is going to be the regulator's biggest question as well. And the biggest, if I, lack of a better term, concern, how are firms maintaining that continuous oversight with comfort? And I think it comes down to, really the chief compliance officer. How are they getting comfort? Are you comfortable from going from an environment where, especially if you're small to medium size, where you can be in the office and workspace and in each other's spaces and feel that, the ambience of an office, to having to be behind screens where you can't see and hear conversations and get a feel for, what's being discussed in the workplace. So how are firms tackling this? I think it's been first a mind shift, attitude shift, and acceptance that we are moving to this virtual realm where we're having to rely a lot more on the individuals, as you mentioned, Sunil. So all regulators will always look at a sort of double-pronged obligation from, the firm's perspective as well as individuals' perspectives, right? So the firm is required to have the required infrastructure in place to monitor, detect, and deter any untoward behaviors, but also the individuals are required to, of course, act with integrity and be accountable for your own behaviors. In this remote situation, we're having a high skew toward individual accountability. So not being able to be in the office where you have, the compliance team next to you or your colleague next to you giving you that continuous, I guess, jolt of consciousness to having to, rely upon your own tools and your own discipline to always do the right thing, remind yourself what is right and wrong. And how do we do this at the firm? Increase training, increase awareness. Are we having automated processes in place, like one of Comply Side's cool tools, where you get automated emails coming to your inbox if you haven't, completed your PA dealing requests or provided your broker statements. So things like that. There's a lot of more frequent things that firms can be doing to do that.
And I would agree with you. I would say that, what we've seen is, people moving away from the Excel spreadsheet, right, in terms of their compliance program, and really using systems similar to every other system, right? Like ERP systems that are out there, HRS systems, compliance have their own systems too, not only for monitoring, but also for tracking and having people fill out different forms. And so by not being in the office, you can start to do that level of work from your home too, right? It's you just need a browser and you could log in and fill out any of the information required from a regulatory perspective. And so we start to see an uptick from that perspective. And, as we start to think about the new normal, I would say, it becomes, much more imperative, especially in this workplace where, you can work from anywhere, like family dynamics, workplace dynamics, all those things start to come into play in order to, create this new normal that we're really starting to face. I know that we have a poll, so Mary Lou, it'd be great if you could provide the poll to everybody. Yeah, so this poll is really about, looking at, like, has your firm had policy changes and procedures to allow for more flexible work arrangements? And it'd be really interesting to see from our audience, how that's changed. And from the results that I see now, we have a 74% positive in terms of, yes, things have changed in the workplace from a flexible work arrangement perspective, which is interesting to see, and tells us, there's a lot of new normal work that's coming about based on this new flexibility. Are there any other final statements you want to talk about in terms of the workplace environment, Ben?
I guess just to wrap up, I think the overall question of working remotely is more of a macro sociological one, right? So how are we adapting from being in each other's space to operating in a bubble? And I think this is obviously a webinar focused on compliance, but actually it goes beyond that and trying to create a culture where you are not just compliant, but also breeding the best working environment and creativity, which isn't always a word synonymous with the investment industry, but breeding that work environment and good air when working with your colleagues. So it's more of a human question that we're all facing or dealing with. It's not specific to us. And again, I think most of our firms can get comfort that regulators are adapting to the changing environment.
Yeah, and just one last thing before we move on to the next topic. There are a couple questions that came in through the question piece. So the first question is, if firms are getting away from Excel, are custom ERP systems being developed on internal platforms, or are outside vendors being engaged? So being part of ComplySci, we supply obviously a platform for compliance in the regulatory space. And so, we look at our system as that type of system that can support the compliance and programs and their journeys as well. And so, outside vendors like us do support that. The other question that was brought up is, what is the target balance to look at for when leveraging cloud between virtual, hybrid, on-prem options? The case is specifically about highly regulated entities like investment and custodial financial organizations. What I would say around that, it's really dependent on the security level of your security teams themselves. So I've experienced where some financial firms only want on-prem because they want control. More and more are moving to virtual and hybrid only because those systems don't require there's less maintenance, there's less issues to deal with when they're in a virtual or cloud environment. And the reason for that is really because when it's on-prem, you have to then worry about disaster recovery. You have to worry about, if that facility gets shut down, what do we do with that on-prem solution? So more and more companies are moving to a more cloud or virtual environment from that perspective. So with that, we're going to move on to the next topic area. Which is cryptocurrency. So with cryptocurrency, I'll just give you a little bit of my preview of it from that perspective, and I'm sure Penn has a lot more that he can offer around this area as well. So for the most part, we've been looking at cryptocurrency. We don't think cryptocurrency is going anywhere. It's here to stay. There's a lot of different cryptocurrencies that are out there. Last count I looked at was like 9,000 different ones. And, every day there's additional ones. Even living here in New York City, the new mayor of New York City has even talked about setting up a new cryptocurrency even for New York City. So maybe one day I will be able to, use cryptocurrency to pay for my MTA bath, getting on the subway or pay my property bill here in New York City with New York City's cryptocurrency. So with that, the way we've been looking at cryptocurrency, at least from the understanding some of the comments coming from the SEC, is that not majority, there's cryptocurrencies that get classified into two areas. Like Bitcoin, Ethereum, these are driven by the market. And so they look at those types of cryptocurrencies more from a commodity perspective. There are other cryptocurrencies that are tied to companies. And so depending on the value of the company and the way the company is structured, those cryptocurrencies are tied to that. And so they look at those more from a security perspective, just like any other stocks or bonds that are associated with a company. So as we move forward, we do think that there's going to be more regulatory scrutiny around cryptocurrencies moving forward. And so I know that even for comply side within the platform itself, we just recently launched cryptocurrency as a new type of security, essentially, in the platform. So as a pre-clearance effort, you can go in, type in the cryptocurrency, we tag it that way, and then you can set up different types of rules from a policy perspective in terms of pre-clearance around those cryptocurrencies. So Ben, I was just hoping to see, from your perspective, how you guys look and talk to your clients about cryptocurrency.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I definitely agree with you that, it's certainly not going nowhere. It's been here for a while now, and it seems to be, it's sticking its heels down and becoming a mainstay in sort of, especially the financial capacity, right? It's creating its own ecosystem, which is very interesting and extremely complex, which is very difficult for regulators to get comfortable with. I mean, if you think of what it was created for, was to create almost absolute privacy and anonymity, and as a byproduct, it's created more pseudonymity, which again is very difficult for regulators to get comfortable with. I think you made a distinction that the SEC makes between the tokens which are transferable, which the UK FCA has categorized as security tokens. Those are linked to companies and more aligned with the ICOs, the initial coin offerings that you see. And then the FCA have defined those which are unregulated, the exchange tokens, and this is your Bitcoins and Ether and Litecoins, etc. Other exchange tokens, which aren't regulated in the FCA's eyes. So they've made a clear delineation of what they're catching currently, but there are elements which are caught as well. So if you have a derivative with the underlying asset being cryptocurrency, this could fall into the realm of being a regulated activity and requiring authorization. So if you're an entity who's establishing, operating, marketing, or managing a fund that facilitates exposure to an unregulated activity, unregulated cryptocurrency, or a business, you will probably be required to have FCA authorization as well. So it's, you notice some of the language we're using is may and probably, and some of the jurisdictions may be, catch different types of securities and tokens. And that's because nothing is conclusive so far, right? There's so much that's still up in the air, so many open questions that aren't yet to be answered. And it's very difficult, and almost like this COVID crisis where you have a lack of homogeneous approach globally. It's almost the same with the crypto space. If I can, I'll go back to February this year in the UK, where you had the, I guess groundbreaking Khalifa review, which focused not just on cryptocurrencies, but on just fintech in general in the UK. And in that review, it referenced the potential of having a Bank of England, a crypto coin, which would be extremely interesting, similar to perhaps the New York coin you were referring to earlier, Sunil. But you have these, I guess, like any new industry that's caught by the financial regulators, you have this weird, delicate balancing act of wanting to be, a good environment to do business in, but also not be a wild west, as Gary Gensler labeled it a few months ago, the chair of the SEC. So there's this sort of to and froing right now, once again, used to what the digital world holds. And I mean, you referenced 9,000 coins are in circulation now, and it's growing every day. But also, it's not just the coins, it's what they're doing. So you have this decentralized financial ecosystem, which creates a whole new stake and prospect, and the digital autonomous organizations, which is a whole new thing that the regulators are having to get comfortable with. And as these things are changing and evolving all the time, it's making the regulators more and more uncomfortable. Things like in the first journal that was published, I think last month, by the Global Business Blockchain Society, 1st November, it came out, and it referenced the commissioner who referenced decentralized finance as well. And it's quite interesting. It goes through different parts of how these entities could be caught by regulation. But it's, again, a lot of open questions, right? So it talks about if you have a crypto exchange, and it sort of meets the criteria what an exchange is, I think in Rule 13B in the SEC rules, then you're pulled into this realm. However, if you are an exchange, you can't facilitate the transaction of unregulated securities. So then, what do? You carve out a whole new lane for these, crypto exchanges. And if you do, again, if you're an exchange, you have to have clearing processes attached to that. Again, this kind of goes away from the layerless approach that the crypto realm tried to create. So there's so many unanswered questions, and again, you'll hear a lot of rhetoric and narrative coming from the different regulators, all trying to collaborate with the crypto world, but there's so much way to go yet, as the system sort of fixes itself and becomes more crystallized, I guess. But we're trying, and I think we're definitely going to get there.
Yeah, and I think that what would be interesting to see is, like, for those that are on our attending this webinar, to see like how if they're actually monitoring cryptocurrency. So it'd be great to see if we can see the next poll. Because I know that for us specifically within ComplySci, like I was mentioning, we've launched it recently. We had about within 1 week, we've already had like 50 companies start to use that feature set within ComplySci around the cryptocurrency. So it's really interesting to see how the uptick of that is happening very quickly.
Yes, here's a question for you. If you've seen some firms having this service offering implemented in their ComplySci offering, is this because the firms themselves are trading in the crypto space?
Potentially the firm is not, but they would just want to regulate or monitor their employees from an assets perspective. We have talked of some firms who, if it's Bitcoin or Ethereum, they don't even monitor it, they don't care, but anything other than that, they say, either they say not to, or they're not looking to regulate that.
Okay, that's interesting.
Yep. And from the poll results, we can see that 40% of the firms online, right, in this webinar are not concerned about it, which is really interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I from a web perspective, it's not something we're seeing in many of our clients. I mean, we had a few queries on it, but from a web perspective, it's not a requirement to yet be really concerned with it. So I can imagine until they're forced to be sort of considering it, then I'm gonna sort of sit on the sideline for now.
Yeah, that makes complete sense. Knowing that we have a few more topics to get through, I was hoping we could just we could start to move on to the next one, which is really tracking MNPI information. And I know that for ComplySci, we've spent a little bit of time, not only talking to the SEC but others, and the questions. So they won't directly come and tell us, but some of the questions in terms of the meetings we've had really focused on MNPI. And so when we talk about MNPI, in a lot of cases, I know that working with other firms, they're really focused on the deal, right? Like, oh, we're a PE firm or a hedge fund, and so knowing classified information either on a security, or if we're looking at purchasing a company from a deal perspective, a lot of emphasis goes on that into those areas. But I do want to broaden the view of MNPI data, and so as we started to think about it and approach it, we're really thinking about it is there any information out there that can move the market? So that includes expert networks. So if I'm going to speak at a conference, or if I have a television appearance, or I'm on Reddit or YouTube from a social media perspective, like there's data and information that I can either have or obtain, or I know that could be potentially distributed or understood that could move the market, right? And so all of these things fall under MNPI data, and really thinking about like ways to track that in general. So as firms start to think about that, they may have to think broader than just like the deal information, or who's crossed the wall from a control room perspective around understanding and knowing certain information. There's other types of MNPI data that potentially will need to be tracked in time, basically. So Ben, I just want to get your thoughts on this as well as you work with your clients.
Yeah, I think MNPI is always going to be, and for a long time I can remember, has been a hot topic for the biggest regulators, SEC and FCA and NFA, and probably most of the global regulators that you'll come across. And how you monitor it is going to be a big thing for the regulators always. Now, when I was at the FCA, 6 years ago, they was just starting to implement sort of a lot of investment to track them and monitor the markets. And I'm aware that the SEC has done something similar in the last few years, where they've invested a lot in technology and training their staff to become really efficient in tracking and identifying any sort of suspicious behavior in the market. Now, all regulators are aware that reports of suspicious behavior and market abuse is probably relatively low in comparison to what's actually going on in the market. So the SEC does certain things, incentivize whistleblowing and carrying out examinations, quite proactive. FCA is quite sort of laid back in the sense where we do a lot of thematic reviews, and we'll do surveys and then produce good and bad practices. And with all of our clients we've worked with, we've always tried to connect those dots, right? So you mentioned, if a firm has expert network calls, or if they're picking up large price moving securities in a day or in a month, are they looking at this? But not are you looking at this just as siloed events, but are you connecting these as coherent events as well? So we have always been advising our clients to connect the process of chaperoning your expert network calls and monitoring your emails and your communication internally with the staff, with large price movers, with movable news that's been released in the market. And then can you paint a picture to say, is anything suspicious? And if you're doing these things, then this is fantastic, right? So you've got a process in place, and you're doing your part at the firm to identify and deter and monitor, which is all the regulators can ask, which is fantastic. However, we've been working with a lot of firms who've been undergone SEC examinations in the last few months, and actually a bit of feedback from them has been, okay, great, you've got these processes in place, but actually we want to see this immortalized in some sort of policy. Don't just sort of do it and perhaps evidence it, but here and there, do you have a structured policy that shows that you are doing this? And it's something that's come up time and time again last year or so. So again, we're working with our clients. If you are FCA regulated, you probably have this in place already. We are very sort of policy heavy, but in the SEC, you may not if you are just a US firm. So just to be aware of that, that the regulated expectations are changing all the time. And I guess that's the benefit of having a compliance consultant like Optima or one of our peers, where you do get the breadth of the market to see what's happening with your peers and sort of get ahead of the curve where possible.
That's right. And I know that for us at ComplySci too, when we built our control room, at first we were 100% deal focused, but then as we took a step back and started to talk to customers and understand their specific needs, we really then started to shift. I mean, it was sort of a pivotal shift for us in terms of really being broad about how we think about MNPI data and looking at ways to track like expert networks, NDAs, conference appearance, TV appearances, all these different ways, channels. Even you can even set up an icon for golf meetings, because I'm sure there's a lot of trading of information even then as well. So with that, I was hoping to see if we can get the next poll out there around MNPI compliance. So it'd be interesting to see how how MNPI plays out for the people on this webinar, and how they if they're anticipating or if it is a priority or not. So we have a high correlation to yes, and they've created policies around it. So Ben, everything that you've talked about is coming to fruition in terms of people looking at MPI data and having true policies around that as well. So your work has been very fruitful on this.
I'm more interested in the 4% you don't have. That was a concern. I wonder if it's relevant to them at all. That's interesting.
That's very interesting. Okay, so moving on. So I know we have a few more topic areas to go through. So really talking about data management. And so, with data management, there's tons of data out there, right? And how do you sift through all the data in terms of, the types of information that you should be looking at? How do you filter through that to understand what you need? And then, what are the mechanisms and tools around that? So obviously there's lots of questions around this piece, and how do I store it? How do I process it? How do I deal with GDPR from a data privacy perspective on top of these things? And so I know that, as a chief technology officer for ComplySci, this is one of the main focus areas for me and my team in terms of thinking about data and data approaches around this. So obviously, from a compliance program and journey perspective, we're always thinking about employee information that is coming in. Also, based on that employee monitoring information that's coming in, how do we then have it connect into the different types of feeds and data feeds? And then how do firms get access to understand if there's truly a violation or not? I know that for us, this is one of the major areas of from a data management perspective that we spend lots and lots of time on, and spend lots of time on trying to figure out and understand. So, I know that, we leverage, obviously from a technology perspective, we will leverage lots of different things to help us track and understand this. So, obviously we talked about MNPI data from a control room perspective. So collecting that data, Other things that we have too is really looking at conflicts of interest types of checks. So as you're starting to approve things, is there a conflict? How do I find out whether there's a conflict across the board? Specifically, like thinking about it, if there's a trade or if there's an OBA or if there's all these like siloed data elements. And so how do I search across all of these things to understand if there's any sort of conflict of interest? And then layered on top of that is data privacy. So we have GDPR in the EU and other privacy rules and regulations here in the US as well that surround this. So all of these things come to the forefront of managing a program. On top of that, you got to manage your program, manage the people around the program, monitor your employees, and then worry about the data that's associated with it as well. So Ben, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this as well.
I mean, I think, there's wouldn't be much to add in terms of what you referenced. I think, we see the exact same things on our end, right? So from a control room perspective, certainly the larger firms with multiple divisions and, countless people to monitor, it's you're going to need automated process in place to monitor this stuff, to capture and keep on top of are you sending your broker statements, are you being reminded to do so? One or two sort of people in the compliance team going out to hundreds of individuals to meet a deadline isn't very efficient use of anyone's time. So having the process that you've referenced just now, was definitely very useful. But actually, we're seeing an interesting trend in regulators asking, for this. They're asking firms in examinations, do you have any automated processes in place to monitor your compliance protocols? And we're seeing a lot of smaller firms who, under 10 individuals may not have considered this before, now sort of putting this into play. So it's definitely become much more of a relevant and a useful tool, I'd say. I think, when you are a smaller firm starting out and you are introduced to, you may be, a CCO and COO all in one, wearing different hats, and you may be doing everything or doing a few things on the operational side and compliance side. And when you are a few individuals, it's okay to deal with. But the bigger you get, you definitely want that assistance to do it. And instead of hiring a new individual, makes more sense to engage with a compliance side to help with that. And then on a sort of briefly, I'll go into the GDPR side of things. From the UK and EU perspective, you've always had the requirement to be responsible for your data and to have certain things in place that encourage responsible dealing with information. But what GDPR did was make it a lot more prescriptive. So having things like control of access. So are we having traders have access to folders, HR folders, and vice versa? Shouldn't really be happening. So having that controlled access was a big play in bifurcating who has access to what, and also changing passwords and things like this. So now we have to put real credence on how we're handling and processing data. Is really put a lot of emphasis on what firms are doing to meet that requirement.
That's great. That totally makes sense. If we can do the poll, that would be great, and to see how constituents on this call are thinking about it. I know that for us too, like the data within our systems are growing, and then we also look at it from the perspective not only just of employee monitor, but like firms providing firm trade data and other types of external system data coming in, so that we can start to correlate a lot of this information together to truly see if there's anything going on. Oh, that's interesting. So like 63% of the say it's going to increase. Nobody says it's going to decrease. So it's either going to stay the same or it's going to increase over time. So which is really interesting to see.
Yeah, I can imagine as well. I mean, as you have new regulations come into play as well, that there will probably be a new requirement that we're not aware of yet ourselves that will require, you know, more data to be managed. So it's interesting as things evolve.
That's right. And then for our last topic, it's really about what's the future regulatory outlook? You know, like what are we starting to see from a trends perspective? I know that, you know, for us, you know, we did year 1 of SMCR. We're now in year 2 of SMCR. And so we're starting to see more and more firms, especially in the UK, start to leverage this capability just because like before they thought, you know, as I mentioned earlier, like, you know, trying to manage it through a spreadsheet, trying to track all this stuff down is more difficult than it seems. And especially with SMCR, where the workflow, you know, there's the input from the employee, there's the input from the manager, there's the input from the compliance officer, and then final sign off from the compliance officer, and even from HR, and all of these things coalescing together, you know, make for a little bit of a tedious workflow, but you know, technology is being leveraged to support and manage that workflow. And then also from the marketing rules perspective, you know, thinking about reviews and that sort of stuff. Ben, it'd be great to hear from you in terms of these items as well.
Yeah, so I mean, with respect to SMCR, as you said, we're sort of just jumping into the second year of it, and it's been interesting. I think when any new regulation is introduced, you have that sort of you know, the technical guidance and instructions being used in the first few weeks, and then as the year progresses, you sort of get a, I guess, a congruent swaddling into the center of what industry practice says. So you have that, you know, technical guidance versus industry practice. And I think this has been very clear in the SMCR as well. We've had a number of interesting questions come to the fore. If you are, you know, a UK, if you are a multi-office fund and you have offices in the UK and the US, and you have, you know, a non-UK PM managing UK staff, you know, question has been, you know, is that non-UK PM caught by one of the certifications? And technically, if you look at the rules, 627.13, then you're going to think maybe it does count, but actually, entry says that this isn't really practical. Otherwise, you'll be catching, you know, a good lot of people in different areas. So and vice versa, if if you're a UK PM who manages non-UK traders, what's the catch there? Are those non-UK traders caught by the client dealing function? Again, the answer is going to be no, unless executing from the UK entity. So you have these different nuances which have been, you know, more addressed towards the, you know, mid and back end of implementing SMCR, which has been interesting. And actually, I suspect that you're going to have a few things changing throughout, you know, years 3 and 4, because if you think what SMCR is, it's designed, of course, to increase accountability, but also to you know, go through the appraisal process to make sure that we are certifying individuals, and the firm taking responsibility for ensuring that individuals doing their jobs are suitable to do so. So
Yeah.
are we aligning this with, you know, with the appraisal process, etc.?
Which makes sense. And Ben, you know, just for those people who are online, you know, it'd be great if you could just, because we use SMCR as an acronym, and obviously, like working at it, you start to think about it. But there's a lot of people that actually don't know what SMCR is for the UK. So I know SMCR stands for Senior Managers and Certification Regime.
Yeah.
So it'd be great if you could just spend a minute just talking about what it is that they're trying to do.
Sure. So there were 3 sort of prongs to this regulation, and the overall objective was to increase accountability for senior managers. So if you were a large, you know, a fund or bank, and you had a manager with jurisdiction over different divisions in that entity, and something happened in this entity, who would the regulator go after? And sometimes it would be difficult to pin down and say that, you know, the overall manager in the US really had oversight in Hong Kong, for example. So SMCR was designed to really increase accountability and track in real time who's doing what, who has responsibility for what areas, so that if something does happen, does occur, then we know exactly who to speak with. So it makes explicitly clear what roles are being performed, when they're being performed, and who by. And then you have, the underlying of that, which is the certification regime, which change a lot of how the FCA, I guess, approves a lot of the individuals. So if anyone's familiar with the FCA register, you would have had individuals who had what they call the customer function C of 30. And these mainly your traders or your investor relations persons. And the FCA would approve these people. But actually they're saying, the onus is on the firms to do their own due diligence on these people and say, look, you're doing your own digging and making sure that they're okay to work with your firm and undergo these activities. Great. If anything happens, it's all on what you've decided on what you've done. So it's a long way to say that it's really just designed to increase accountability and explicitly clear on who's responsible for what areas of the business.
Sure. Do you have any familiarity with the SEC marketing rules? I know I'm switching topics really quickly on you, but in the interest of time, I think that we probably have some people who might be interested on that compliance rule that's coming out November 4th, 2022.
Sure, yeah. So, SEC effectively merged changes to the advertising rule and the cash solicitation rules into a single rule, which is the marketing rule. Now, this became effective the 4th of May, this year, and investment advisors have been given an 18-month period to transition into that. So that's basically until November the 4th next year. Now, the biggest thing, I don't have time to go into the details of it, but the biggest thing is that firms need to start preparing for this, now. So far, clients are sticking with their current policies and procedures regarding the old rules, and Optima, as well as outside counsel, have recommended that client transition into the marketing rule in 2020. Now, preferably the next time you're going to do your next turn of compliance documentation, you should be implementing this now. The SEC already has a few FAQs providing guidance on the new rule, and we anticipate that this will continue during the transition period. A significant FAQ confirmed that the marketing rule must be adopted in entirety once we're transitioning, which means firms can't sort of monkey branch and cherry pick between favorable provisions between the new and old rules. So again, Optima, the firm, we're advising clients to amend their marketing and advertising policies and procedures sometime between beginning of Q1 and the end of Q2 next year, and give some lead time before full adoption. If anyone has any questions more around the marketing rule, then I'm happy to have sort of further conversations outside of this. I'm sure we're running out of time now, but yeah, there's sort of everyone should be aware who it affects now of the new rule.
Okay, great. I think it'd be great to, knowing that we only have 8 minutes left. We should get this poll out there and see how our constituents are thinking about this. I know we didn't talk about this topic area, but we look at all of these things, like from SMCR, even the marketing rule, and I know for me, from a technology perspective, like how do we create more automation and how do we increase the capabilities of compliance teams and compliance officers to get their jobs done. So I know it doesn't directly relate to what we just talked about, but I feel like with regulatory changes that are occurring, leveraging technology to support those changes helps everyone in general to be compliant and working towards that more future automation. So as you can see, 70% are looking at more automation in their world. So that's a good sign in general around all of these different items. I know, as time is ticking right now, as we come to close around this, Ben, it'd be interesting to hear any sort of wrap up or final thoughts in terms of, what we've talked about or top priorities for next year. And I can, after you speak, I'll talk about some of the priorities that we have as well.
Sure. Well, I think, there's, as always, in the world of compliance in the financial industry that we're in, things are always changing, right? Things we're not always expecting, such as COVID. But I think the important thing to remember that, we have the capability to adapt, and we have been adapting pretty well, without sort of clients and end users being adversely affected, which is the main goal, right? Which is why we do everything we do. Sunil and I both help firms support clients and make their job more efficient. And I think, in the new year, there's nothing in terms of real scary regulations that's coming about that firms shouldn't be able to handle. But the end and the last poll that went up, Sunil, was very interesting. I think is definitely correct. As we're having more and more regulation come into play, things will definitely, be more automated, which makes sense.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. When I think about the compliance, and I've mentioned this as a couple times, like the compliance journey, right? Like I don't look at it as like, oh, we've set this program up and now it's just going to run and we don't have to do anything, right? It's truly a journey in terms of, you're starting at A, you go to B, you may get some twists to get to C, and then you're like still working, climbing the mountain to get to D. So through that journey, people are going to learn, your programs are going to mature, you're going to leverage new types of approaches to your compliance program. And I think that, through automation, your focus can be much more narrowly around what truly is impacting you from a compliance perspective. As you get more automation in place, your attention can then be focused on areas of like, violations, like case management types of issues, things that are truly like take greater mind share around your program. And then those things, as you start to solve those things, hopefully you can automate some of the aspects of your program as well around those things, so that way you can move on to the next thing. And I think that for us internally to Comply Sci, I know that we always are thinking about the program journey, and then how do we mature our offerings, and how do we think about the compliance officer, their day-to-day, and improving that from an automation perspective. And so I know that we've gone through a number of capability enhancements in terms of not only the platform but also through some acquisitions as well. And so as we start to look at like these programs in the light of even the acquisitions that we have, we're always thinking about like, okay, how do we make sure that we're the first call that a compliance officer has in order to solve a certain type of issue moving forward. And so I know that really helps us think about our approach from a platform perspective. And I'm sure for Ben, for you too, as compliance teams are calling you guys too, if you're their first call, that you potentially have solutions that can solve them for them as well. So I know that these are big priorities for us in general, in terms of the programs themselves. And especially for next year. So as we think about, and I have a mental framework, and I'll just lay it out there since I know that we're running out of time, but my mental framework is, you have policies that you create, you educate people on those policies through education and training, or even through, attestations and certifications. And then we have employee monitoring for pre-clearance against those policies and rules. And then finally, if you find violations, those violations then are, you address those violations, but then those things all tend to inform your policies and procedures. So it's this like round trip aspect to a compliance program in general. And so that's how, we all think about it. And that's the way we want to help our customers also approach it from a program perspective versus a point solution perspective in general. Any other words, Ben?
No, I won't bore anyone else any further. No, that's all good for my end.
That's right. And I want to thank everybody who joined the call And I thank everyone for the questions that were brought up. They were great. And, the answering of the polls was super interesting for us in general as well. And so I want to thank everyone for joining and being part of this webinar today.